Yes.
I just want to make sure that we have Simon back with us as well.
Yes, he is.
Yes, thank you.
There he is. Lynne, can I turn to you and what was happening for you in Wales? Following the Archer inquiry, a recommendation was made that the Haemophilia Alliance would be established. And you attended, that was in 2009, you attended for the first time on the 14th of November 2011 as a patient representative.
Yes.
Knowing about the Haemophilia Alliance, what were your expectations of those meetings?
Well, I thought that when the Archer recommendations were made, that the Alliance was meant to be a group comprising of patients, clinicians, Department of Health, and that group, as per Archer, was meant to include issues about care and support. But when I went to those meetings, they'd already been going on for 2 years. I didn't start going until 2011, and support had been omitted from the terms of reference. So that was a concern to me. My cousin had just died, so obviously we'd lived through the experience of a family member dying. And I felt that all the issues that I'd gathered from the patients in Wales regarding obviously lack of financial support, lack of provision for hepatology, monitoring of hepatology, there just wasn't an appetite at those meetings for those issues to be covered. I went obviously as a Welsh representative, and my feeling was that they saw Wales as very much a side issue, and that was something that needed to be sorted out in Wales. Whereas I felt if the cohort were infected, UK-wide, I knew there would be other people who were in the same position as my own family had been in, and many of the people that I'd spoken to and gathered experience from in Wales. But I found that the Department of Health meetings, the chair was the Department of Health. Can I say the names?
I don't believe it's been redacted, so yes.
Right, so the chair of the meeting was Rowena G. Cock, who was head of blood policy, and in her absence, Ben Cole would take over. They were jointly chaired by the Haemophilia Society. But basically, the whole day would be taken up by some sort of Department of Health. There would always be presentations by the Department of Health, and you wouldn't really know you were in a meeting to do with haemophilia or infected blood or any of those issues. And then I just felt that there was no focus on the real issues that I knew were affecting the community in Wales. And as I say, I thought the same would be happening in the UK. And at those meetings, I met many people from England. I actually met somebody from Scotland as well, but not Bill. And basically, they were all saying the same things. They were coming to those meetings. They were desperate. There were people dying, and they were trying to get to the meetings. They'd travel for miles and miles to get there, expecting that there would be something done. They'd think that if they told the Department of Health what was going on, they really felt that something would be done, but it all fell on deaf ears. We'd find that during the course of the time I was attending, the minutes would never be circulated. We wouldn't get an agenda. You'd be missed off the circulation list. I just felt that I was perceived as a bit of a troublemaker, really, because I'd go with my list of issues. I'd present on the issues that were affecting people in Wales. But basically, they just move it on to the next item and say, oh, well, that's a Welsh problem. Do you want me to go on?
No. We're going to come to the specific issues, the clinical issues that you campaigned on in Wales towards the end of the evidence today, because it's a very important part of your evidence. But just staying with the Haemophilia Alliance and how that was functioning, you've said you were perceived as a troublemaker. How did you get that perception?
Well, basically, because there would be the Department of Health officials, the haemophilia doctors. There weren't any Welsh haemophilia doctors there, so I didn't personally know them. But it was very much, they'd look at each other and think, oh, well, that's your problem, that isn't really our problem. And I was arguing for a national policy. If they had put this into the National Service Specification on haemophilia, where people with contaminated blood had access not just to hepatology services. We were asking for access to consultant hepatology opinion because we knew so many were dying and they weren't being monitored. They weren't being diagnosed with advanced liver disease. And basically, by the time it was picked up, they were presenting at A&E, swollen with ascites, on trolleys without beds. And all the people were saying the same thing. But the haemophilia doctors, it was as if it was a separate issue. It was a side issue to them. And that wasn't the position of our clinicians in Wales. We had good support from them because obviously they knew their patients very well. Our centres are, relatively small compared to England. And I just couldn't believe that the as well as Department of Health, it was the UK HCDO, they didn't seem to want to address any of the problems. The Haemophilia Society would come to the meetings and they'd present on some other initiative they were trying to, get funding for at the time. And I just felt it was sickening, really, that people were coming and they were desperate. And I actually met as one of the campaigners, and I didn't know they were related at the time, but his uncle, and he'd come to the meeting and, he was waiting on a liver transplant and he wanted some answers from these people. And they just keep saying, well, we can't distinguish between route of infection. You shouldn't be having priority over other people. And we would say, well, yes, we should, because, we were infected by the state, infected by the NHS. It's not covered in the haemophilia care. It's not in the National Service Specification. And that would have been a way that they could have come together and had a national policy on how to deal with this cohort of people. And from what we'd seen in Wales, there were massive gaps in care. And basically, people were just dying. They're being admitted through A&E. Deaths weren't being recorded as attributable to liver disease or liver failure. The Department of Health, that was another issue. I always brought it up with them. Why don't you record the cause of death? They would just record the fact of death, and they'd put the onus back onto the doctor who was there at the death.
Why was that so important to you, Lynne?
Well, because it had to be documented that they were dying as a result of infected blood, and that wasn't happening. So unless the family specifically asked for, can you put HIV or can you put hepatitis C on the death certificate, that wasn't happening. Obviously, I do know about, there are families who didn't want HIV, obviously know the group very well. But the hepatitis C was a real issue. And I just felt that those deaths and, from liver disease, it was just swept under the carpet. They just grouped them all with the same cohort of people who were, alcohol, drugs, whatever. There was no priority given. And, knowing the people who died, the stigma was terrible because that left such a lasting effect on the family, the fact that their loved one had died. And the nurse who was looking after them on a general ward didn't even know how they became infected. It happened with my own cousin as well. There was, the nurses, you can't touch him, he's got hep C, wear gloves. And that was said, in the open.
In the Haemophilia Alliance meetings, you've said that a lot of things were seen as a Welsh issue.
Yes.
How involved were the Welsh government or officials in those meetings?
Well, at that point, at the very beginning, before we sort of told them we weren't happy about it then, Welsh government were really disinterested in it. They were invited to the meetings, but they would come to meetings. I remember one particular meeting where there were some patients who were quite ill. Welsh government reported back to the meeting that there was no progress, but we'd actually had a major breakthrough and we'd had a hepatology appointment made in Wales. So they didn't really know what was going on, basically, and I felt that they weren't really interested at the time.
And just a moment ago, you said that financial support was excluded from the remit of the Haemophilia Alliance. Was that ever raised at any of the meetings you were at?
I raised it a lot, but it was never minuted, like lots of things weren't minuted. And they would just say it's not within our remit. So any discussion about money or finance was just excluded.
It was later decided that the Haemophilia Alliance would be replaced by clinical reference groups. What was the effect of that on Welsh patients?
Well, I strongly objected to that, and the last meeting I attended, I did make a big fuss about that, because I said we don't have a UK-wide group now as Archer intended. This was meant to be a group that came together with patients, who were experts in their condition, haemophilia clinicians. Should have been hepatologists, should have been on that group, HIV specialists, dentists should have been there. All those gaps in care with haemophilia that everybody was experiencing, that was the forum for it. And it was meant to be, an exchange of good practice around the UK. And in the last meeting I attended, I really, stood up and said, look, this just shouldn't happen. And nobody supported me. I just was the only one in the meeting who wanted the Haemophilia Alliance to go on, because I felt, well, for Wales, we'd lost that contact. Scotland the same, obviously Northern Ireland, all the devolved powers, because our care in Wales is managed differently. We don't have CRGs, we have WISC, who are the Welsh Health Specialist Services Commission, so they're in charge of haemophilia care in Wales. So we had no forum to take any of our issues to.
And so I think in your statement that the sense is that there was the Archer recommendation and the Haemophilia Alliance, and that petered out.
That petered out, and that was done for a reason, because basically, my opinion is they didn't want to resolve the issues. They wanted to sweep the whole infected blood cohort under the carpet. And as each family, as a family member dies, lots of people drop away. And I think bit by bit they thought they'd all be dead and there would be nothing to do. And, the haemophilia doctors that I saw at the Haemophilia Alliance, they obviously, they had patients with infected blood. But I felt the fact that they couldn't relate to that with the stories that we had from Wales, and there was nobody representing us from Wales except me, I just felt that they didn't really show any concern about that. We had issues regarding endoscopies, where people couldn't get access to endoscopies when they were when they had cirrhosis. They were denied access to that because of the variant CJD. I took a letter to the one of the Haemophilia Alliance meetings about that. And again, they said it's a Welsh problem, but this had actually happened in Birmingham. It wasn't, because that was the liver specialist centre that our patients would go to from Wales. And it would have been so easy to resolve, to have a strategy in place where all this group of patients, not that many of them, were looked after, and they had the care that they were entitled to.
So in terms of the chronology, we've talked a little bit about the Archer and the outcomes of the recommendation from that. That takes us back, Bill, to you in terms of the Penrose inquiry. If we pick up in about 2011, when you really returned, it seems, to the fray of advocacy and campaigning, prior to that, you'd been writing letters to MSPs to press for the inquiry and press for progress with the inquiry. But if I can pick up your position as chair of the Scottish Management Committee in 2011, and we'll pick up it there. Part of your work at that point was to rebuild the political connections that had previously existed. Is that right?
That's correct.
And so you've said in your statement that in 2012 and 2013 you held some parliamentary briefings, including one in April 2013, where Alex Neil spoke about what the government intended to do after Penrose was published.
Yeah, the way things work in the Scottish Parliament is that it was trying to, the new Parliament had tried to make itself open and accessible. So if an MSP, and I have to pay tribute to Richard, the former MSP Richard Lyle here, he organised for us to have several presentations to MSPs, actually. One of the most memorable was actually in the garden lobby of the Scottish Parliament. I happen to think it's a magnificent building, and that's where everybody gets together. It'd be a bit like, well, I'm not that familiar with the the Houses of Parliament, but the Great Hall or whatever, the place where people go. And it was extraordinary because we actually got 20 MSPs along, I think, to the first one. And Alex Neil came and spoke. And he spoke at a subsequent one in one of the committee rooms. So we'd got not only MSPs hooked in, but we'd got ministers hooked in by this point.
As an organisation, Haemophilia Scotland were gradually drawn into the inquiry
Yes.
as well and became a core participant in February 2014.
Yes.
We'll come to the interactions with the MSPs after the Penrose report in a moment. And you'll be aware that this inquiry is not an inquiry into an inquiry. But thinking about the process of the inquiry and the report itself, I want to ask you what the impact of the Penrose inquiry was on you.
Exhausting. Utterly exhausting. And that very much coloured our judgment when there were proposals coming about for this particular inquiry. And we learned so much from the Penrose inquiry, not necessarily from its report, albeit there was a substantial body of evidence that came forward that clearly this inquiry in its PRAC documents is drawing upon. But we learned about, I'd written a letter to the then Health Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, which is one of my submissions, where I made various suggestions about what should happen in terms of the conduct of the Penrose inquiry. I suggested, for example, that we use the web. Most people that are watching today are not in this room, they're on the web. Now, Scotland's still a pretty big country stretching from Shetland down to the borders. And Lord Penrose didn't accede to that. He wasn't that keen on the press attending. I was very keen that this was a public inquiry, and remarks were made by the chair of that inquiry at times about the presence of the press and media. We weren't actually funded to go and watch, so we weren't seeing the inquiry on the web. We weren't being funded to actually attend it as people are here today. And in terms of the evidence, Lord Penrose was very much leaning toward anonymity on the part of us who'd been infected or affected. We didn't have the choice. I would have been perfectly happy to be Bill Wright in my statements, but everything was redacted. The witnesses who appeared, in total, unlike, there's been a huge number of witnesses appeared here of people who've been affected and infected. I'm looking at some. And there were only, I think, Philip, the dear departed Philip, said about 6. It was actually a bit more than that. I think it was 12 or 14. So you didn't get the impact of the personal stories in the way that there has been in this inquiry. And that was really hard because we didn't feel we were being listened to. So we didn't get that personal input. The terms of reference I'd made various suggestions about. We'd expected when there was a terms of reference about examining matters generally, and we felt that that was an enabling term in order for Lord Penrose to look quite widely at the various issues that arose around it. He narrowed that right down, and I had personal experience of that in relation to my own story. The word generally, he always wanted to keep things general rather than look at individual stories and put the pieces of the jigsaw together in that respect in terms of people's different experiences. So I also, and I have to confess, I'm experiencing from time to time similar experience with this inquiry. The issue of pace, it felt like our council was asked to respond to huge long documents within a few days. They came to us for instructions, And we tried to respond. I was in island of Colonsay at one point, and you can imagine, what the broadband connections are in the Isle of Colonsay. And it was a matter that I knew particularly about. So my wife and I we were staying in a self-catering accommodation. We're dashing backwards and forwards to the local hotel, trying to sort of, talk to Thompson solicitors and to email them, and it was a nightmare. Whereas it felt like Lord Penrose gave himself quite a number of months at times to deal with various issues.
And you've said that the impact on you was exhaustion.
Yeah.
Was there anything else that you wanted to say about the impact on you personally? How it felt?
It did colour my judgment toward inquiries. And we'll come on to the dramatic week that the report came out, which I will never ever forget. Boy. But I think the period of Maxwellisation, the 2.5 years between the final sitting and the day the report came out, was a weird time, because it came out March 2015, and the final hearing, which was an additional hearing that frankly we'd forced Lord Penrose back to a public hearing about statistics, and that was a really grim day because unfortunately, sadly, Lord Penrose had just had some very bad news about the health of his wife. He wasn't in the best of moods that day. But that period between October, when we were developing as a charity, and March 2015, was a very strange time, because we'd had this frustrating period where we hadn't necessarily got the correct terms of reference. They weren't looking at, for example, financial support. They were never within the terms of reference of Penrose, rightly or wrongly. I think at the time we kind of felt that we'd had these undertakings from Alex Neil and his successor that they would look at it at the end of the inquiry. We didn't think we were going to have to wait 2.5 years for that report to come through. And that was problematic for us because people were still dying during that period. And there's a particular instance of someone who died. There was another really weird situation in that there was a sort of core participants group that Thompson's drew together in order to take soundings from us. It was about something like 14 people. So we meet in this room in Thompson's, and council was there. Council would instruct us, you're not allowed to tell each other what your names are. That was the degree of anonymity that was forced upon us by the chair. In other words, he said, you cannot identify each other. So we had this weird thing that more than half of us knew each other. And we're sort of saying, oh, well, I'm going to tell, it was really weird. I mean, these were people we knew really well. And so we had this weird sort of situation that we were sort of giving our views on. It was a weird and difficult time.
And that evidence, Bill, is that a reflection of your own experience of the impact of it, or do you draw on the broader impact on the infected and affected community in Scotland? Was that the similar experience of the rest of the Scottish community?
I would say there was a lot of frustration. And I pay tribute to, there's an individual here today who was involved in the briefing group that instructed the sort of working group that I wasn't initially involved in, and people like Bruce and Alice and Philip, who gave some really good input to the inquiry. But whether it was listened to, I'm not sure.
The report, as you say, came out on the 25th of March 2015. That afternoon, there was a private gathering of Haemophilia Scotland,
Yes,
together with Nicola Sturgeon and Shona Robertson.
yes.
Can you tell us what happened at that gathering?
Well, I'll never ever forget that day and the following day and the week running up to it. Might have set the context here in terms of what had happened in the morning. We'd, as core participants, been given advance sight of the report. And we knew in Scotland that this was going to be really, really bad news. One single recommendation from a £12 million inquiry. And we're looking at this and we're thinking, wow, what do we do here? However, what we also knew was that we had supportive ministers. And so we got to that morning. We'd already been working very hard that week to read the report, talk to our solicitors, prepare the press and media, because we'd organised a press conference that morning. And I think you were there, Lynne, that morning at the
Yes,
press
I was
conference
there,
when
I think I
the report was presented. And the report was presented by the secretary to the inquiry. And there was sort of two tiers. There was people who'd come from Wales and England who, as hadn't been core participants, who were shouting whitewash. And this poor, relatively junior member of staff had to present this. And I'm a guy in a suit, and what we decided to do, we'd been advised, is don't have a press conference in another place, do it in the same place. And we'd actually spoken, we'd made contact, so we decided to make it in the same place. So we got a whole bunch of people really angry up the back shouting whitewash. We'd got the nation's press at the front. And because we had to react to this publicly. So I've got the combination of sort of people wanting a bit of drama and awkward questions, press people, and people just feeling at the back. However, we knew, because we'd been in touch with Scottish Government, that we could move forward because, and I made a speech to that press conference, and I'd gone up to this secretary and said, that must have been dreadful for you, the poor woman. And I think some of the people at the back didn't necessarily recognise me. Who's he? So here's a guy in a suit. We'll just shout at him as well. And so I thought, how the hell do I rescue this? So what I did was I grabbed the Penrose. There was one of these sticky things in front of the table, grabbed it and threw it away. And I think that did get to the television that night on ITV and BBC. And then I started to make my presentation. So, however, we decided that we had to deal with the press and media. However, we knew that people were going to be very, very upset. And Dan and I and others had talked around this, and we thought, people need to go to a quiet place in such circumstances. So what we did was we organised a get-together along the road. And I think you maybe came to that as well, Lynne. Yeah. In fact, you had the opportunity to speak to a minister.
I did, yes.
And what we'd organised was for the First Minister and the Health Minister to come and meet people without the press there. And that was so important to do that, because that way you get in your face the real stories. When people have settled down and they start to tell the stories. And I remember Shona Robertson, the Health Minister, saying afterwards, it was those women that made me want to act. She sat at a table. I remember, actually, my wife was sitting at another table, And she said to me, who was that woman that's sitting at the table with us? And I said, that was Maureen Watt, the Public Health Minister, Junior Minister to Shona Robson. I think John Swinney might have been there as well. So we were working away to get these messages over. And the good thing is that the likes of Lynne was able to bring Welsh experience as well. So that was the start of a whole new chapter, and a very important chapter for us.
And the next day, a question was asked in the Scottish Parliament. If we can go to that, WITN 2287078, please. Page 2, please. We can see on the right-hand column. The heading Penrose Inquiry, and Nicola Sturgeon was asked what the government's position was on the Penrose Inquiry, and she was challenged that it was a whitewash. If we go to the bottom of the second column, we can see her response about the question of it being a whitewash. I can obviously understand the feelings, frustration, and even disappointment of all those who were affected by the dreadful events. However, I was struck particularly by comments that Bill Wright of Haemophilia Scotland made yesterday. I thought he was correct in his assessment that despite his disappointment, there is a narrative setting out the case that cannot be avoided by the government and its moral responsibility. On behalf of the Scottish Government, I certainly accept that responsibility. And it carries on, taking account of the wider findings of the report and in consultation with patients and families, we will act to implement the report's recommendation and take forward the review of financial support as a matter of urgency. And that afternoon, Shona Robertson made an announcement in the Scottish Parliament, didn't she, that further work would be done on financial support and in relation to additional psychological support. That, as you say, was the start of a different phase in Scotland. Is that fair?
Can I just say two things about this? First of all, until this point, until the Scottish Government felt able to move following the report from the Penrose Inquiry, we'd been facing the sort of approach that had been taken that's represented in the submission I made about Susan Deacon's comments. Force them to the courts. Let's force them to the courts. We're not interested in morals. Let's go to the courts. That day, when I heard that, and it was really funny, I was speaking to Bruce about this yesterday. I think he mentioned it in his evidence. It's not because I was name-checked, but it was because there'd been the press conference that I'm talking about, we gave them a copy of my words, my speech. That ended up in a briefing from a senior civil servant to the First Minister, and about how government was going to respond. So it wasn't the fact that I was name-checked, it was these words. There is a narrative setting out the case that cannot be avoided by government and its moral responsibility. On behalf of the Scottish Government, I certainly accept that responsibility. That is one hell of a thing for any politician to hang themselves with. And I remember at that point, I had to leave the chamber. Here I was, a middle-aged, grumpy Scotsman. I was exhausted and I ended up howling like a baby because, like Bruce, what I didn't realise was that he was howling as well. And Susan grabbed me and hugged me, and I, all the way down in that lift, I wept my eyes out because I knew that that was the big breakthrough for us in Scotland. Because of those words. And of course, we then went on to have a dialogue, a proper constructive dialogue with government that I hope to hell Sir Robert Francis has with people here when it comes about the announcements, and we follow up in the announcements in March. So what I didn't realise, Bruce was howling, I was exhausted, and then we had to go and meet the minister in the afternoon, and a group of us, and talk about what happened next. We had already made proposals to the minister about what happened next, and it had to be an inclusive process. Unlike the bit that I've missed here was the David Cameron response. At the very same time as I was in my hind legs in Edinburgh, the Prime Minister was in London saying, I apologise. He didn't actually explain what he was apologising for. My bet is that the First Minister in Scotland would have a better idea about what she was apologising for, and the Scottish National Blood Transfusion Service would have a better idea about what they were apologising for than Mr Cameron in London, because he also said, well, here's an extra 25 million. This is the wrong, I'm sorry, sir, but this is the wrong way to do government. You have to engage with people. You don't just throw money at people. I wrote a letter that night. I was up all night between the 25th and 26th, writing this letter to David Cameron. The Haemophilia Society were a bit annoyed because I got in before them, but that's all old history. And I asked him questions. Where does this figure 25 million come? What's it for? How's it arrived at? I never got an answer. No answer from the Prime Minister. I learned from a journalist that was at the press conference that day about that announcement that was taking place hundreds of miles away. Where's the decency in all of this? I'm sorry, sir.
What are you sorry for?
I can become very passionate about that particular episode.
That's part of giving evidence, I think.
I mean, what the hell was going through Cameron's mind, for Christ's sake? What was his briefing? Where were these people? Were they talking to us? 25, oh yeah, just let's give them 25 million pounds. The journalist says to me, David Cameron's just announced an extra 25 million pounds. How do you react to that? I'm sitting there with all these people there. And I said, that's a damned insult. I had to think on my feet. There was some people here that were there at that moment. And the Times journalist came back to me and said, well, what do you think is a fair amount? And I said, that's something that we will discuss with due respect to you directly with government, not via the press. And we will try and engage people in that process, the people who've been affected. And that's why I feel very strongly that in the exercise that's about to come about here, announced in March, that everyone in this room and everyone out there watching this feels they have some ownership in. That is good government. Taking views, taking ideas, not just chucking money. I mean, 25 million. It was a damned insult. I stand by that. Sorry.
You don't need to apologise, Bill. I'm going to pick up financial recompense in a moment. I want to turn to Lynne and to Simon in relation to a couple of matters in relation to the public inquiry. Lynne, if I can pick up with you just before the Penrose report at an APPG meeting on the 17th of April 2013, could we have WITN 3988072? And it's page 5. Sorry, if we start at page 2, we can see what it is. We can see the heading at the top that it's the APPG on haemophilia and contaminated blood at the House of Commons, and various MPs were there. Was this a regular meeting that you attended, Lynne?
Yes, yeah, I always attended. We had a lot of support from the Welsh MPs, so when it was obvious that the Archer recommendations weren't going to be implemented, we started gathering our forces really together and encouraging people to write to their MPs as well as their Assembly members to try and address some of the issues. We were doing the same thing down in Wales as well. And at that point, we'd had a task and finish group had been recommended to address the gaps in care in Wales. And I was part of that group. And I gathered patient experiences, and they were all the things we already knew, but we had to get them documented. And then, as well as that, I obviously used to go to the all-party group because we had supportive MPs, people like Owen Smith. He'd instigated the backbench business debate in 2010 or 2011, but then he was promoted to become a minister, so it was Geoffrey Robinson took over the debate. But we heard from all the MPs in Parliament about the real issues that were affecting their constituents, and then that led to another weak review, shall I say, by the government and an announcement in 2011, which meant that people weren't really any better off.
Just pausing there, the point I want to pick up with you from this document is slightly different. Could we turn to page 5 of the document? And at the bottom of the document, we can see your one of your contributions. There are many in this document, but one of the contributions is you explained that an acknowledgement of what happened is what everyone wants. I think it's Jason McCartney from Con Valley then said, confirmed MPs made that point in the 2010 HAC debate.
Right.
And there was the suggestion on the next page of another backbench business committee debate.
Yeah, so
Just in terms of that work you were doing, seeking a public inquiry and as you say, seeking acknowledgement of what had happened, what was happening at this time?
nothing, nothing really. It was the same old thing, government, they'd have a consultation. They'd make the questions so narrow that people couldn't answer the questions, or, they couldn't highlight the issues they were having. We had real issues with people regarding financial support. The government would then, they'd just do as little as they possibly could. It would be, as Bill said, an insult. People were relying on something being done because they, morally, as we've just heard, morally, government had a responsibility to do that. And every time there was an announcement at Westminster, there wouldn't really be very much in the announcement, but it would be, a big PR exercise for the government where they'd announce how much money they'd already given the scheme since they were set up. And then in the devolved nations, we'd always have the same thing, same pattern. The minister wouldn't know that Westminster was going to make an announcement. There'd always be a delay. Because we had better communication with Welsh Government, we'd always have an opportunity to go in and speak to, the Health Minister. I think it was Edwina Hart at the time. And Welsh Government would make little tweaks to whatever the announcement had been. So we would relay issues about, again, monitoring. So they agreed they would have fibre scans to monitor.
Just staying on the much more narrow point
Sorry.
for now, Lynne, about the public inquiry and the campaign for a public inquiry.
So there was
We've got this in 2013.
Yes.
I think at the time you were also having meetings and writing letters to Alan Cairns,
Yes.
Cohen Jones and Vaughan Gethin.
Yeah.
What response did you get in relation to the seeking of a public inquiry?
The public inquiry. Initially, I would say that Welsh Government had obviously been briefed by Westminster, so they didn't feel there was any need for a public inquiry. The usual thing, Archer inquiry, had said there was no fault, there would be no benefit in having another inquiry. As a cross-party group, as we gathered more and more strength with that, and we had more and more meetings, obviously the key politicians in Wales Julie Morgan, one of them, but, you know, Mick Antoniou and Dr. Di Lloyd, they were all they'd been involved since the beginning of the Assembly, Di Lloyd. They knew how strong the feeling was in Wales, so they started to veer away from Westminster in that regard because they heard the personal stories, and basically many people at the meetings, they were never going to benefit from financial support because they weren't included in any schemes anyway. And the fact that we were still asking for, you know, partners to be included in the scheme after 30 years, it was just a joke, really. So Welsh Government, then they started to support the calls for the public inquiry. That was a big turning point. You know, obviously Julie Morgan, she led that. But it wasn't like that in Westminster. It was a battle all the way. And then eventually in 2017, Welsh Government voted in favour of a public inquiry, and that was a real breakthrough.
And that was a unanimous vote by the Welsh Assembly on the 25th of January 2017.
Yeah, and we had a big debate in the Assembly, and we had the names of all the people who had died, and they ran around the Senedd as all our Assembly members spoke. The Assembly members knew all their constituents, and obviously they were able to relay the stories. And we had a vote. It was a votable motion, and there was a unanimous vote for a public inquiry. We'd had similar debates in Westminster, the backbench business debate we'd had, same stories about the hardship, the suffering. The MPs themselves, Welsh MPs, they obviously the same. They knew their constituents. They all supported it, but then government would bring in a 3-line whip, and that would just all be decimated. Or they'd try and bring in a wrecking motion. They'd change the the bill, and then we'd hear in the House of Lords then from, can I say, Earl Howe.
I'm not aware of the name being redacted.
So the government would introduce a wrecking motion, and you'd have the likes of Earl Howe in the House of Lords, because we were obviously lobbying at that time that it was something along the Irish settlement we were looking for, because it was a much broader scheme that included more of the affected people. It had life assurance, mortgage protection, priority access to healthcare, and members of the House of Lords, such as Lord Howe, would say that why should they introduce that? They couldn't discriminate between the route of infection. All it would lead to would be people jumping the organ donation queue. So,
and again, just returning to the question of the public inquiry, there was the unanimous vote in the Welsh Assembly.
yes.
And then I understand you met with Vaughan Gethin on the 23rd of November 2017 about the public inquiry. Can
Yes.
you tell us about that?
Yes, so, and he agreed then that he would write to Jeremy Hunt in support of a public inquiry. At that time, we'd had consultations in Wales. This was after the Task and Finish group. We had workshops around Wales where Welsh Government met then again with all the families, and the stories were told again. And basically the strength of feeling was so strong that Vaughan Gethin, the Health Minister, said, well, he had to write. And obviously we were delighted because it was a massive breakthrough. There'd never been a government that would support it. But Welsh Government said, well, they had nowhere, that's what they had to do. They knew it wasn't going to work any other way. So that was a huge breakthrough for us.
Just pausing there in terms of the campaign work you did for the public inquiry, what was the impact of devolution on your campaigning?
So as far as devolution was concerned, I think it was good insofar as we had good access to Welsh Parliament. It caused confusion when an announcement was made, but it gave us the strength to lobby our Welsh Government, and obviously they supported us then in our calls for the public inquiry. So I suppose it was twofold, really.
And we're going to come back to the financial recompense in all three nations in a moment. Simon, you've described in your statement, thank you for your patience, you've described in your statement, you described Penrose as a whitewash. To what extent did the infected and affected community in Northern Ireland hold out hope that certain issues would also be resolved by the Penrose inquiry?
That's a very good question, and I'll answer that in 1 second. If I could first of all say, having listened to Bill and Lynne, I'm in some ways a Johnny-come-lately to this process. I've been canvassing and campaigning or advocating for about six years, but to listen to their stories, they have been pioneering in setting up with others the context for where we are now. In terms of the situation across the devolved assemblies and in terms of the constituency of Northern Ireland, I would say haemophiliacs here have had less access to the political awareness and the political interaction that has taken place in England, in Wales and Scotland, rather, with England. We in Northern Ireland, as a cohort of victims, as a cohort of people who have been enduring the process, have been enduring the process. I think, to answer you very briefly, people didn't have a lot of hope. There's a difference between hope and expectation and hope and reality. And I think most people felt this is just another go. If there is anything, if there is further consideration, we might get something. We might get some benefit from it. But there wasn't any strong belief that we would have any issues addressed. Bear in mind the history of Northern Ireland being under direct rule. Our Department of Health would have responded to the guide and direction from central government, from the Department of Health in England. So that was the process by and large, and people had come to accept their lot reluctantly. But in reality, that appeared to be it. So we wouldn't have had a great expectation. It didn't give up hope, but we wouldn't have had a great expectation.
And after the Penrose inquiry report, you wrote to all Northern Irish MPs in relation to a public inquiry. Can you tell us what you were seeking in those letters?
Yeah, I did indeed. Actually, first of all, when I saw and I listened to what Bill was saying, I felt anger. I felt anger at what had come out of that. I felt that it had been underwhelming, would be a very generous way of putting it. It had not achieved its aim. It had not served the people. Perhaps it served government, but it didn't serve anybody else. And I felt that there was a moral issue at stake, and the moral issue was that government would do what is right. And I felt personally that I should write to all the Westminster MPs in Northern Ireland to make contact with them, raise the awareness of the issues, encourage or challenge them to be more aware of the needs coming out of these failed inquiries, and that haemophiliacs and people infected across the realm with the contaminated blood issues should be better served and be given a voice, and their voice be recognised. After Penrose, there was a great feeling that we'd just been beaten down.
I want to move on to the question of financial recompense with each of you.
Could I just add something, because obviously you put the APPG in front of me. What I would say is at that meeting, I think I'm right in saying it was Anna Sawbury attended that meeting.
Yes.
I don't know, is that the right one? Yeah, and I would say that one of the Welsh MPs remarked that she was the worst brief minister that he'd ever met. So she came to the meeting completely just not briefed at all. She'd been sent the questions ahead of beforehand, I think, by Diana Johnson. She couldn't answer any of the questions, and she obviously had no understanding of what people were looking for. So again, it was just that lack of interest in government. Just deny it and push it away, and they'll stop coming. That was all I wanted to say.
Thank you. I want to move on to financial recompense, and I'm afraid, Bill, it comes back to you to start with.
Can I stop you there? I'm not sure how long we've got to go before lunch, but this is all rather embarrassing. I might have a very quick comfort break, sir.
Well, sure, let's take a lunch break now, since we're
Sorry,
going to run
sir.
something else. No, don't apologise, for goodness sake. So let's come back, shall we, at 10 to 2.
Thank you, sir.
So 10 to 2.
Thank you.